He was humiliated for his dream, she laughed. Know your place, she said. But Harvard decided otherwise. Post in the comments where are you watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the latest stories. In a cramped apartment in one of the poorer neighborhoods of a sprawling city, 16-year-old Bob Carter sat at a wobbly desk fashioned from salvaged wood. The evening light fought its way through a single, smudged window, illuminating the worn pages of his notebook. Bob's pen moved steadily as he poured his heart out onto the paper. A letter of dreams, a manifesto titled, "Why Harvard Needs Me." Every word he wrote was a testament to his determination, his passion, and his burning belief that his future was not predetermined by the color of his skin or the poverty that clung to his community. Bob had grown up in a neighborhood where opportunity was scarce and dreams were often dismissed as mere illusions. Despite the hardships, a dilapidated playground, a constant hum of sirens in the distance, and the weary faces of neighbors who had long given up hope, he possessed an inner brightness. His mother, who worked grueling night shifts at a local factory, often reminded him that education was the key to breaking free from the cycle of poverty. This wisdom had taken root in Bob's young heart, and every night after the world outside grew dark, he would sit by the light of a battered desk lamp and envision a life where his intellect could lead him far beyond the confines of his immediate world. That very evening, as Bob scribbled down his life story interwoven with aspirations of attending Harvard, his thoughts danced between the hardships he faced and the future he yearned for. His essay was not just a college application. It was a window into his soul. In the lines of his draft, he wrote about the resilience that pulsed through his veins, instilled in him by the struggles of his community. He spoke of the injustice he witnessed, the systemic neglect, and the unwavering belief that his unique perspective could help transform societies plagued by inequality. With every sentence, Bob knit together personal anecdotes of overcoming obstacles and the quiet dignity of hope. The hope that one day, institutions like Harvard would open their doors to someone who defied the stereotypes that had long confined him. As the classroom emptied after school that day, Bob remained at his desk, deep in thought and immersed in his writing. Outside, the fading laughter of his peers echoed down the hallway, but his focus was unbroken. He was determined to create an essay that spoke not only of academic potentials and intellectual achievements but also of his lived experience. A narrative that challenged the conventional profiles of Ivy League applicants. In his mind, Harvard was not just a symbol of elite education, but a beacon of possibility for those like him, individuals whose talents and passion had been overlooked because they did not fit a predetermined mold. Unknown to Bob, however, his sincere endeavor was about to become a catalyst for a public drama that would reverberate far beyond the walls of his humble classroom. As he carefully revised his draft, the weight of history and personal struggle intertwined with every carefully chosen word. His handwriting, neat yet determined, seemed to pulse with a rhythm that spoke of resistance. Bob knew that his story was more than an academic exercise. It was his declaration of self-worth, a declaration that he would not be defined by his impoverished surroundings or the prejudices that sought to limit him. Later that day, while Bob was still lost in his passionate work, his English teacher, Mrs. Holloway, happened to glance at the title of his essay as she tidied up the classroom. A frown creased her face. In her eyes, aspirational ambitions like Harvard were reserved for those who fit a certain image, a stereotype shaped over generations by privilege and polished mannerisms. With a mix of condescension and disbelief, she scoffed, "Harvard? Know your place." Her words, laced with disdain, echoed harshly through the empty classroom as she chuckled at the audacity of his ambition. In that moment, the room, once a sanctuary of self-expression, became a stage for public humiliation. The scoffs and mocking whispers quickly spread to a couple of influential classmates, including Marcus and Leon, who shared in her mirth, adding their voices to the chorus of ridicule. Yet Bob did nothing to escalate the situation. Instead, he closed his notebook quietly, gathered his few belongings, a tattered backpack, a creased notebook, and a pen that had seen better days, and left the classroom without a word. As he walked down the long corridor, the laughter and taunts followed him like unwanted shadows, but inside, he carried a calm dignity. Bob knew that his aspirations were not diminished by the narrow-mindedness of others. He was aware, even at his tender age, that the road to greatness was often paved with ridicule, and that the true strength of one's character was measured not by the opinions of those in the moment but by the relentless pursuit of one's dreams. At home, the modest apartment provided little warmth beyond the soft hum of the old refrigerator. His mother returned from her late shift exhausted, yet her tired eyes lit up when she saw Bob's serene yet determined expression despite the day's trials. Without needing words, she understood that her son had faced humiliation, yet he had not bowed under its weight. She often reminded him, "Your dreams are mighty, Bob. They are the only things that can lift you higher than this city. Remember, even in darkness, a star's light is the most brilliant." Her encouragement was the silent reassurance that fueled his perseverance. That night, lying in his small bed with the hum of the city drifting through the window, Bob's mind replayed the day's events. The sting of ridicule lingered, but so did the unyielding spark of determination. He whispered to himself that one day, the same institutions that had mocked him would clamor for his voice. His letter to Harvard was not merely an essay, it was his prophecy. And as he drifted off to sleep, visions of a better future danced before his eyes. A future where dreams, no matter how humble in origin, would shatter the confines of stereotype and prejudice, and where the truth of one's worth would finally be recognized by the world. The following day, as the urban pulse of the city continued outside, the bell rang and students began filing into Mrs. Holloway's classroom. A sterile environment adorned with faded posters of literary greats and inspirational quotes that, ironically, seemed unable to uplift the spirits of many. Bob Carter, still carrying the quiet resolve from the previous day's intimate moment with his notebook, found himself seated at the back of the classroom. His desk was worn from years of use by students just like him, and he opened his battered notebook with care, preparing to continue a task he held dear, refining his essay titled, "Why Harvard Needs Me." Every word, every carefully constructed sentence, was an image of his struggle, his hope, and his unwavering belief that education could usher him into a world where his dreams weren't bound by the poverty of his neighborhood. As the class settled into a low hum of chatter and light rustling of papers, Mrs. Holloway, an imposing figure known for her rigid expectations and a penchant for dismissing what she considered overambitious young minds, entered the room. Her steely gaze swept across the room as she welcomed the students, but her eyes soon halted on Bob's notebook, its title boldly printed at the top, its heartfelt words spilling across the page. For a moment, silence fell as if the classroom itself held its breath, waiting for her reaction. Unable to conceal a sneer, Mrs. Holloway crossed her arms and leaned over Bob's desk, her voice dripping with condescension. "Harvard, Bob Carter?" she drawled with exaggerated disbelief. "Really now? Perhaps you should be satisfied with a job in a fast food restaurant before you start dreaming of Ivy League institutions." Her tone was not the calm, professional admonition one might expect from a teacher, but the scorn of someone convinced that Bob's aspirations were laughably out of reach. At that moment, the quiet murmur in the room erupted like a sudden gust of wind. Marcus, a student from an affluent family known for his impeccable clothes and sharp tongue, looked over from the front row, and with barely contained laughter he remarked, "Looks like someone's reading bedtime stories about success while you're out here daydreaming, Bob." His words were accompanied by snickers that quickly spread through the classroom like wildfire. Leon, another classmate always quick to join in, added mockingly, "Yeah, why reach for Harvard when you can reach for, well, maybe the corner store." The cascade of ridicule was swift and merciless. Even those who had once been indifferent couldn't help but join in the chorus of derision. Despite the cacophony of laughter and whispers, Bob maintained an almost eerie calm. With his eyes fixed on the page and his pen poised in the air, he continued working on his essay, his inner voice echoing the promise that his dreams were larger than this moment of mockery. Though his heart pounded quietly in protest behind a placid facade, each snide remark only steeled his resolve further. He believed that true potential could not be measured by the narrow eyes of those who were quick to jump to conclusions based merely on superficial judgments. Mrs. Holloway's voice rang out once more, louder this time, as if to silence the burgeoning laughter and restore order, even if through further humiliation. "Bob, you do well to understand your place," she declared sharply, using a tone that was equal parts authority and disdain. "Not everyone is cut out for Harvard. Some of us ought to know what's realistic." Her words reverberated across the classroom and were met with a mix of suppressed laughter and awkward glances. For many of the students who lived in worlds far removed from the lofty ideals of elite education, her statement was a cruel affirmation of the status quo, a reminder that their aspirations, if they dared to dream differently, were destined to clash with societal prejudices. The weight of the moment seemed to settle over the classroom. Classmates who had joined in the laughter now exchanged looks. Some seemed unsure if they had been complicit, while others wore expressions of smug superiority. Even those who were less inclined to participate in such cruelty observed quietly, as though they were witnessing a ritual of social hierarchy being reaffirmed. Bob, for his part, quietly snapped his notebook shut as if to guard his precious words from being further tainted by ridicule. Without raising his voice or drawing attention to himself, he gathered his few possessions, a worn backpack, a couple of dog-eared notebooks, and a pen that had long accompanied him through similar trials, and left the classroom, each step measured and dignified. Outside the classroom door, there was a fleeting silence, a brief pause during which the weight of what had just occurred seemed to settle in the hallways. The echoes of laughter and taunts lingered in the air, but so did something else, a sense of quiet, unspoken resilience. Bob's quiet departure was noted by a few students who, even in their indifference, were moved by the stoic composure with which he faced public humiliation. Though many did not dare to voice it, a ripple of respect began to form among those who understood that greatness is often born out of enduring the harshest of trials. Later that afternoon, as the unrest from the classroom slowly diffused into the routine of the school day, whispers began to circulate. Some students shared fragments of what had transpired. Mrs. Holloway's dismissive sneer, Marcus's jeering tone, and the cold detachment in Bob's eyes. Yet very few spoke about the true essence of Bob's essay, the powerful ideas woven into its fabric by a mind that dared to dream beyond the visible constraints of his environment. In a school hall lined with lockers that had borne silent witness to decades of youthful ambition and disappointment, Bob's quiet defiance stirred a promise of change. At home that evening, when Bob's mother returned from her exhausting night shift, she noticed the quiet look on Bob's face, a mixture of sorrow and steadfast determination. Though she was unaware of the exact words hurled at her son, the silence and the careful way he held himself spoke volumes. Without probing too deeply, she offered a warm embrace and a soft-spoken reassurance that the world could sometimes be cruel, but that his dreams were too precious to be denied on account of ignorance and prejudice. "Keep dreaming, my boy," she said gently, "for your dreams are the light that will guide you to a better tomorrow." In the quiet of that modest home, amidst the muted hum of a refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city, Bob Carter's resolve began to solidify further. Though his peers had laughed and ridiculed, and though the voices of triumph and failure mingled uncomfortably in the corridors of his youth, Bob understood on a fundamental level that dreams of a different future are not measured by the immediate opinions of those who would cast them aside. His essay, titled "Why Harvard Needs Me," was more than an application. It was a declaration of his worth, an appeal to institutions that held promise for a society that truly believed in second chances. And even as the memory of public humiliation still stung, Bob carried with him the certainty that his journey was just beginning, and that the true measure of his worth would eventually be recognized by those who valued potential over prejudice. After leaving the classroom, Bob Carter walked slowly along the narrow, graffiti-marred corridor, his footsteps echoing in an almost meditative rhythm. Outside, the late afternoon sun struggled through the haze of smog and city noise, and every step Bob took was weighted by the sting of ridicule and scorn he had endured just hours before. Yet within him, a quiet determination was growing stronger, a belief that what others saw as a failure or a punchline was only a small chapter in the story of his life. As he navigated through the crowded hallways of his under-resourced high school, Bob's mind was a tapestry of conflicting emotions. The earlier brazen laughter of his classmates, especially the mocking jabs from Marcus and Leon, still reverberated in his thoughts, but instead of embittering him, they fanned the embers of his resolve. He recalled every word he had written in his essay, the carefully chosen phrases and the dreams of a future far removed from the confines of his current reality. That written testimony of his hope was his private victory, a declaration that his potential could not be measured by the shallow judgments of those who had never struggled as he had. Bob reached the back door of the school and stepped out into the cool, uneven pavement of his neighborhood. The sounds of the bustling city, distant car horns, sporadic shouts, and the rhythm of life that never entirely paused for a moment of despair, welcomed him like an old friend. With each step, he reminded himself that a single day's humiliation could not erase the fire burning deep within him. He clutched his battered backpack a little tighter, the contents of which were more than just textbooks and notebooks. They were his tools of transformation. Arriving home, a modest, time-worn apartment block tucked between remnants of urban decay, Bob pushed open the creaking door and stepped into the familiar scent of home-cooked dinner mixed with the aroma of possibility. His mother, a resilient woman whose gentle eyes belied years of hard labor and unspoken sacrifices, waited for him in the small living room. Although exhausted from another long night on the factory floor, she always made time for Bob, her quiet strength a stark contrast to the harshness of the world outside. "Bob," she said softly, her voice both tender and firm, "I notice you've been quiet today. Was everything all right at school?" Her tone was laced with sincere concern as she set down a worn bag of groceries on the table, her eyes searching his face for clues of distress. Bob hesitated, considering the best way to encapsulate the day's events without reliving the acute sting of public humiliation. Instead, he offered a faint, tired smile. "It was a challenging day, Mom, but I've learned something important." His words, though few, carried the weight of experience beyond his years. That night, after dinner, a modest meal of beans and rice that nourished more than just his body, Bob retreated to his small room. The walls, adorned with faded posters of famous inventors and civil rights leaders, were a silent homage to the dreams he held dearly. He sat at a rickety desk by a single light bulb and unfolded the same notebook in which he had poured out his thoughts just a day earlier. As he reread his essay, every sentence filled him with renewed resolve. The echo of Mrs. Holloway's scornful words lingered, but so too did the steady beat of his inner conviction. To him, those words were not the final verdict on his worth but a challenge to prove that his dreams, his voice, and his perseverance were bigger than any sneer. Outside, the hum of the city continued unabated as the night grew deep and quieter. In the solitude of his modest room, Bob allowed himself to reflect on the day's events with a clarity that could only emerge from adversity. He recalled his mother's gentle embrace and the reassuring tone in her whispered, "Keep dreaming, my boy," words that transformed his pain into a wellspring of hope. In that quiet moment, Bob realized that his true strength lay not in how loudly he could proclaim his dreams, but in the dignity with which he carried them, undaunted by the ridicule of those who refused to see beyond their own narrow expectations. Over time that night, while the world outside slumbered, Bob's resolve grew ever more tangible. He began to rewrite portions of his essay, refining his arguments and embedding deeper insights gleaned from today's trials. Each stroke of his pen was a small act of rebellion against the limitations imposed by others, but more importantly, it was an affirmation of his belief in a future where merit, passion, and perseverance would triumph over prejudice and derision. By the time the first light of dawn crept through his window, Bob had rewritten several pages, a testament to his unwavering commitment to his dream of attending Harvard, not simply as an academic achievement, but as a symbolic gateway that would allow him to champion change in a society too quick to dismiss potential. Even though the scars of humiliation might remain etched in the corridors of his memory, Bob Carter understood that each setback served only as a stepping stone towards something much greater. His aspirations had become his backbone, fortifying him against the cruelty of the world that scoffed at the hopeful and the determined. In that small room, as the sky warmed with the promise of a new day, Bob made a silent vow that no one's narrow view of his potential or lack thereof would ever dim the brilliance of his dreams. He would continue to write, to build, and to believe, confident that in time, institutions like Harvard would recognize the depth and brilliance of his intent. For him, this was not merely about gaining admission to an elite college. It was about affirming his identity and challenging the stereotypes imposed upon him by a society that too often forgot to see the beauty of resilience. While Bob Carter turned the page on another difficult day at school, far away in the quiet, hallowed halls of Harvard's administrative offices, fate was quietly taking shape. In a modest, book-lined office nestled within Harvard's sprawling campus, Dean Samuel Whitaker, an esteemed figure known for his keen insight into human potential, sat immersed in the pile of hundreds of essays that had arrived with the current admissions cycle. His days were filled with a steady stream of academic achievements, polished narratives, and formulaic self-reports. Yet, amid the abundant submissions, one essay caught his weary eye almost purely by the bold, unapologetic title, "Why Harvard Needs Me." It was as if the words of Bob Carter leapt off the page and demanded attention. With careful deliberation, Dean Whitaker began to read. The essay was raw, unfiltered, and brimming with authenticity. Unlike the typical self-praise that filled most applications, Bob's words recounted a personal odyssey of persistent struggle and quiet defiance. He spoke candidly of the harsh realities of the impoverished neighborhood he called home and the daily battles he fought against a world quick to dismiss him. Every word was imbued with a palpable, heartfelt urgency, a dream not of empty ambition, but of genuine change. Bob recounted nights spent studying under a dim lamp in his cramped room, the constant hum of city life, and the chilling echoes of ridicule that accompanied his aspirations. Yet he also described an unwavering belief that his potential was not dictated by his zip code or the tired stereotypes of his environment. As Dean Whitaker read on, he found himself deeply moved. The essay was more than just a college application. It was a manifesto of resilience and an impassioned plea for recognition of the hidden talents and untapped promise in people's society too often overlooked. Whitaker felt the stirring of conviction in his own heart. He remembered vividly his own humble beginnings and the transformative power of education. He recalled how stories like Bob's had the power to disrupt assumptions and inspire collective progress. In that moment, Bob Carter's raw narrative shattered the veneer of indifference that sometimes cloaked the Ivy League's polished exterior. Without hesitation, Dean Whitaker rose from his desk and dialed a number. The conversation was brief, just enough to express his astonishment and enthusiasm. He explained to his colleague in the admissions office that this essay was not a mere exception to the norm, but a clarion call that demanded immediate attention. "This is the kind of authenticity we need," he stressed, his voice steady but burning with fervor. "It's a declaration not only of personal ambition but of a courageous spirit that sees beyond the confines of circumstance." After formalities and assurances that the essay would be given every consideration it deserved, Dean Whitaker made another, even bolder decision. Rather than wait for the usual correspondence, he resolved that he must meet the young applicant face to face. Without regard for protocol or the usual distance maintained between administration and prospective students, he envisioned a personal visit to the local high school, a chance to see firsthand the boy who had dared to dream so unapologetically. That afternoon, as the sun cast long beams across the venerable brick facade of Harvard University, Dean Whitaker prepared his briefcase with a single goal in mind. In his heart, he believed that true potential often emerged from places no one expected, and that sometimes the most transformative change began with a single, courageous step. He composed a short note of encouragement, signed with personal warmth, and arranged for a discreet team member to schedule an appointment at the high school that Bob attended. Back in Bob's modest neighborhood, the contrast could hardly have been starker. The bright and imposing world of Harvard was galaxies away from the rough asphalt of dilapidated sidewalks and crowded apartment buildings. Yet, the quiet revolution had already taken root in Bob's heart when he penned his essay. Unaware of the storm his words had ignited at Harvard, he continued to nurture his dreams despite the daily barrage of derision and indifference. His classroom, though cold and uncaring, had become an unlikely crucible in which his determination was continually tested and refined. At home that evening, after a long day of silent endurance, Bob's mother noticed a peculiar glimmer of anticipation in her son's eyes as he checked his mail. An envelope, neatly stamped and bearing the emblem of Harvard University, rested on the modest kitchen table. There was an invitation, a request for a meeting with a representative from Harvard. The envelope was simple, yet its contents would forever alter the trajectory of Bob's future. A surge of quiet hope filled him, and even the memories of earlier insults began to recede into the background of his steadfast ambition. In that unfolding moment, as a young dreamer prepared to step toward an extraordinary possibility, the seeds of a transformative journey were sown. Dean Whitaker's belief in Bob was not just institutional endorsement. It was a reverberation of the truth that great potential, when nurtured and recognized, could rise from even the most challenging circumstances to transform not only a single life but the very fabric of society. The morning sun broke over the horizon with a quiet promise of change, casting a golden glow along the cracked pavement of Bob Carter's high school. In the weeks since Bob had tucked away his courageous essay, life in his modest world had been the same. A challenging routine marked by quiet resilience and small victories. But today was different. Today, an invitation brought by none other than Harvard itself was about to turn his life upside down. At the start of the day, rumors had begun swirling in hushed tones among the students. Whispers of an unexpected visitor, someone from an Ivy League institution, rippled through the hallways. Bob entered class with his head held high, though the weight of last week's humiliation still lingered in his memory. His eyes, however, burned with a quiet fire that had only grown stronger after receiving that fateful envelope from Harvard, with the emblem of excellence and a neatly printed invitation to meet a representative of the university. The moment of reckoning came during the mid-morning break. The school hallways, usually filled with the clamor of chatter and clattering lockers, fell into a hush as a figure in a meticulously tailored suit, carrying the unmistakable air of authority, strode through the front entrance. It wasn't every day that a well-dressed, dignified visitor from a prestigious institution walked onto these grounds. The visitor's presence was immediately magnetic, drawing the eyes of both students and teachers alike. Rumors had barely been stoked when, suddenly, all chatter ceased. The man introduced himself as Dean Jonathan Merrick, a senior dean of Harvard University, and his calm, sincere voice carried clearly over the murmuring students. "I am here today in search of one individual," he announced, surveying the crowd with a steady gaze. "I am looking for Bob Carter." At these words, the silence deepened into an electric stillness. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause in the narrow corridor of the school. Bob's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that the man was not speaking metaphorically or as part of an elaborate prank. It was a genuine call to him. His classmates, including those who had once derided him for his dreams, exchanged incredulous looks. Even Mrs. Holloway, who had once sneered at Bob's audacity in front of the class, seemed nearly at a loss for words. The dean's footsteps, measured and purposeful, brought him closer to the row of desks. "Bob Carter?" he called out again, focusing his warm yet unwavering look upon the student who stood quietly near the back. Bob's pulse quickened as all eyes, both curious and expectant, turned in his direction. Without hesitation, a timid yet resolute Bob stepped forward, his worn backpack slung across his shoulder, his hands slightly trembling with anticipation. Dean Merrick extended his hand, his smile gentle and sincere, a smile that radiated confidence in Bob's potential. "It's a pleasure to meet you," he said softly. "I received an essay from you, one that not only spoke of academic promise but of resilience, authenticity, and the fire of determination. Your words have resonated deeply with us at Harvard." His articulation was deliberate, his tone carrying a profound respect that seemed to elevate Bob above the mundane judgments of high school hallways. The classroom door, previously ajar in anticipation of routine lessons, now became the stage for an encounter that would rewrite the narrative of Bob's young life. Students, for whom the idea of Ivy League acceptance had been nothing more than a whispered myth, watched intently. Marcus and Leon, who had joined in the taunting laughter just weeks before, were now rendered speechless in the face of an authority that validated Bob's dreams with unequivocal sincerity. Even Mrs. Holloway, who had once belittled Bob's ambitions with a sneer, "You'd do better with fast food than thinking about Harvard," now stood rooted to the spot, her face a mix of shock and regret. Dean Merrick continued, addressing not only Bob but the entire assembly. "I want everyone here to understand that the true measure of talent isn't defined by where you come from but by the strength of your resolve, your perspective on the world, and the power of your dreams." Bob's essay, "Why Harvard Needs Me," is proof that potential can emerge from anywhere. And today, that potential is recognized and celebrated. A murmur of awe and admiration rippled through the gathered crowd. Bob, though still in a state of measured disbelief, felt tears prick the corners of his eyes, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief and validation. For all the years he had battled a world quick to judge him by his circumstances, this moment affirmed that his unique voice mattered. The resilience that had carried him through days of ridicule and nights of solitary writing was now being acknowledged by one of the nation's most esteemed institutions. The dean took a few more moments to speak privately with Bob, gently asking about his experiences, his goals, and the challenges he had faced. In that conversation, Bob's quiet determination shone brightly. He spoke of the long nights under the dim light of his desk lamp, his mother's sacrifices, and the weight of the numerous rejections he had internally prepared for. Dean Merrick listened intently, nodding with genuine interest and occasionally interjecting words of encouragement. Outside the classroom, word of the encounter spread like wildfire. Students congregated in clusters, comparing notes and reenacting in hushed, excited tones the dramatic entrance of the Harvard dean. For many in the hallways, that singular moment marked the beginning of a new understanding, a recognition that dreams, no matter how audacious or rooted in challenging origins, deserved respect and attention. By the end of the period, Bob's name was spoken with a reverence previously unknown in the corridors of his school. Even those who had once dismissed his ambition now looked upon him with a budding appreciation, as if they had glimpsed at a future where the underestimated might rise to transform their world. The air was thick with the promise of change, a call to re-examine what true potential meant and to acknowledge that the ancestry of one's birth did not dictate the horizon of one's future. As the bell rang and students dispersed, leaving the echo of Dean Merrick's words lingering in the corridors, Bob Carter lingered by his desk. He held the memory of that encounter close to his heart, knowing that this day had irrevocably altered the trajectory of his life. The proud declaration of his worth had been recognized by Harvard, a symbol of an institution that valued not just pedigree, but the spirit of perseverance and authenticity. In that transformative moment, Bob realized that every setback, every sneer, and every moment of doubt was simply a stepping stone along his journey. His dream of attending Harvard, once ridiculed by those who could not see beyond their own limited expectations, was now affirmed. And with that acknowledgement came a newfound determination to forge ahead, to let his academic journey and personal growth serve as a beacon for others who dared to dream despite the odds. The entire school seemed to hold its breath one crisp autumn morning as the final bell signaled the end of classes. Today was not like any other day. In the old, high-ceilinged auditorium of Carter High School, the atmosphere was electric with expectation. Word had spread that a distinguished guest from Harvard University was about to address the student body. For many, the thought of an Ivy League representative paying attention to their humble school was astonishing. For Bob Carter, who had quietly borne the weight of ridicule and hardship, this day promised something extraordinary. The auditorium was packed. Students, teachers, and staff huddled together in front of rows of creaking seats and a modest stage adorned with the school's crest. At the front, flanked by the school principal and a pair of nervous teachers, stood Dean Jonathan Merrick of Harvard University. Dressed in a meticulously tailored suit, his presence exuded both gravitas and genuine warmth. His eyes swept over the audience, settling momentarily on the familiar faces of those who had once sneered at Bob's unabashed dreams. Taking a deliberate breath, Dean Merrick stepped forward and addressed the assembly with a resonant, confident voice. "Good morning, everyone. I come before you today with a message about potential, perseverance, and the transformative power of belief." His voice was neither lofty nor condescending, It carried an earnest sincerity that reached straight to the heart. I have spent the past few weeks reading many essays, from brilliant insights to, unfortunately, the usual self-praise we often see. Yet one essay, in particular, struck me like a beacon amid the noise. It was written by a young man whose honest voice challenged the prevailing stereotypes and dared to envision a future beyond the limitations of his surroundings. A hushed silence fell over the crowd as murmurs began to ripple through the crowd, murmurs of curiosity and of remembrance. "That young man is none other than Bob Carter," Dean Merrick declared, his voice growing more impassioned with each word. Bob Carter wrote an essay titled, "Why Harvard Needs Me," that not only conveyed his academic promise, but also his remarkable resilience and a conviction born of real-world struggles. His words were a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who face every day with determination despite the obstacles placed before them. The dean paused, allowing his words to sink in. In that instant, every eye in the room, especially those of the doubters who once mocked him, flickered with a mix of surprise and wonder. Even Mrs. Holloway, who had so cruelly dismissed Bob's ambitions, stood in stunned silence. The echo of past taunts seemed to reverberate like a faint whisper, now washed away by the unwavering truth of the dean's declaration. Marcus and Leon exchanged uneasy glances, their previous derision now consumed by the undeniable gravity of the moment. Dean Merrick continued, "In Bob's words, I heard not the naive dreams of a boy chasing an impossible fantasy, but the sincere and urgent plea of someone who recognizes the power of education to change not just a life, but a community, and ultimately, our society as a whole. Harvard is not simply an institution of privilege. It is a place where potential is nurtured, where each candidate's unique story matters." Bob Carter's journey, marked by hardship, determination, and the courage to dream, embodies the very spirit that we seek in our future colleagues and leaders. As the auditorium grew silent once more, the dean's voice softened, yet carried the firmness of a promise. "Today, I stand here to say this. I want to see Bob Carter among our future students. I want him to join us at Harvard, not simply to complete an academic program, but to contribute a narrative that enriches the entire community. His determination, his voice, his vision, all of these deserve not only recognition but a place at the table where decisions shaping our future are made." A surge of emotion rippled through the crowd. Some students cheered quietly. Others sat with eyes wide, witnessing a rare moment where the barriers of status and stereotype crumbled before the undeniable truth of potential. The applause that erupted was not an uproar of unthinking enthusiasm, but a heartfelt ovation for a young man who had braved humiliation and persevered amidst overwhelming odds. Bob, who had been seated among his peers, felt his heart swell. It was as if each rude comment he had absorbed was being transmuted into courage and pride. In that instance, the snide laughter of his past transformed into the resounding applause of his future. After the formal announcement, Dean Merrick stepped down from the podium and walked over to Bob, extending a firm handshake and a smile that radiated pride. "Bob, your journey reminds us all that dreams are not defined by one's circumstances," he said quietly, ensuring that no one around could miss the sincerity in his tone. "Your essay, your dedication. It stands as a beacon for every student who dares to aspire to greatness despite every obstacle." In that handshake and those compassionate words, Bob felt validated, as if the entire world was finally recognizing the inherent worth within him. The dean's public declaration set off a chain reaction. Teachers looked at Bob with new respect. Even the skeptical students, many of whom had once echoed Mrs. Holloway's harsh words, now saw a glimmer of what true determination could achieve. In hallways and classrooms that day, whispers of Bob Carter from Harvard replaced the earlier jibes. His journey had moved from an isolated struggle in a dingy classroom to a profound moment of national significance. A moment where one's origins no longer dictated one's destiny. The moment of recognition was more than just an announcement. It was a powerful statement against the deeply entrenched prejudices that had long dictated who was worthy of elite opportunities. It was a clarion call that dreams, no matter how audaciously articulated or how humbly born, deserved to flourish. And as the final bell of the day rang, Bob Carter walked out of the auditorium with a new sense of belonging and purpose. His future no longer a distant mirage, but a promise that institutions could, indeed, recognize and nurture greatness where it was least expected. In the weeks following the remarkable visit of Dean Merrick, the halls of Carter High began to transform. The clamor of mockery that once echoed in the corridors had gradually given way to respectful whispers and hopeful murmurs. Those who had once sneered at Bob Carter's bold dreams now watched him with a mixture of awe and reconsideration. Classmates, teachers, and even the once cynical Marcus and Leon appeared subdued by the powerful revelation that a single, determined voice could redefine the narrative of an entire community. The incident became a catalyst for a subtle but undeniable shift in the school's atmosphere, a turning point that challenged old prejudices and reopened the door for untapped potential. Mrs. Holloway, whose early dismissal had stung Bob deeply, was perhaps one of the most transformed. In faculty meetings and casual conversations by the teacher's lounge, her tone was noticeably more reflective. Colleagues recalled how she once scoffed at the idea of a boy from an impoverished neighborhood dreaming of Harvard. Now, as she walked slowly through the hallways past bulletin boards displaying student achievements, Mrs. Holloway seemed to carry a quiet burden of regret. She would occasionally pause at a locker, her eyes meeting those of a student like Bob, and in that fleeting moment, it was as if she silently acknowledged, a stroke of humility, how every dream deserved to be taken seriously. The change was not instantaneous, but over time even the harshest words of the past softened into lessons of introspection and, ultimately, admiration for the spirit that refused to be broken. At home, the transformation was even more intimate. In the small, modest apartment that Bob shared with his mother, evenings took on a different color. The weight of humiliation had not entirely vanished, but it had been transmuted into fuel for his inner strength. Sitting at his rickety desk in the quiet of his room, Bob would sometimes replay the memory of that day when Dean Merrick announced his name. In the silence that followed the thunderous applause in the auditorium, Bob's heart had filled with an emotion more potent than vindication. It was a quiet, resolute affirmation that his identity was not defined by the narrow views of those around him. With each rewrite of his essay and every careful word added to his journal, Bob internalized a simple truth. His worth was as enduring as his dreams, and no amount of scorn could diminish the light that shone within him. The impact of the dean's visit spread like ripples far beyond the walls of Carter High. Local newspapers began featuring stories about the transformative encounter, and community leaders were inspired to challenge the low expectations that had long haunted the neighborhood. A local mentoring program sprang up, pairing successful professionals with students from under-resourced schools. In classrooms, teachers started discussing the importance of resilience and the power of self-belief, urging students to look beyond superficial judgments and to pursue their aspirations with unflinching determination. For many, Bob's journey embodied the possibility of rewriting one's destiny, a symbol that even in a society riddled with long-held stereotypes, merit and persistence could prevail. In a moment of quiet contemplation, Bob often found himself reflecting on how far he had come. One cool evening, after the clamor of another hectic school day had subsided, he sat by his bedroom window watching the city lights flicker to life. In that reflective solitude, his mind wandered back to that fateful day when his essay, so brimming with raw truth and vulnerability, had captured not only the attention of a dean from Harvard, but also the admiration of those who had once walked past him with dismissive indifference. He recalled the piercing look in Dean Merrick's eyes, the respectful handshake, and the resounding declaration that his potential was real, powerful, and needed in the world of academia. It wasn't just an endorsement of his intellect, it was an invitation to transform his life and inspire others by proving that brilliance is not confined to the elite, but that it can emerge from any corner of society when nurtured by determination and grit. In that moment of introspection, Bob vowed that no outward ridicule or preconceived notion would ever prevent him from pursuing his dreams. Every discouraging word from the past had rendered him more determined. He understood that the journey ahead would still be fraught with challenges, but he was now bolstered by the knowledge that institutions like Harvard recognized his potential, and that his story was just beginning to ripple outward into the lives of others. Every line in his essay, every tear shed in quiet resolve, was a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit, a spirit that refuses to be limited by the boundaries of circumstance, prejudice, or even public scorn. As the academic year advanced, Bob Carter's name became a quiet legend around the school, an emblem of hope for those who dared to dream beyond the immediate confines of their environment. The once mean-spirited jibes of Marcus and Leon morphed into subdued nods of acknowledgement, and even Mrs. Holloway's icy remarks had melted into tentative expressions of respect. Bob's journey had ignited discussions about fairness, about the crucial need to look past appearances to discern the untold potential in every individual. In everyday conversations, it was no longer just his story. It was the story of every underdog. Every dream left unheeded was now a dream being heard in some small, significant way. And so, as Bob Carter continued on his long, winding journey toward a future that was now a glimmer of bright possibility, the world around him slowly learned to see that greatness often comes in unexpected forms. His quiet perseverance, immortalized in a heartfelt essay, had broken through the walls of prejudice and had begun to reshape perspectives in a community eager for change. The journey ahead, though still uncertain, shone with the light of promise. A promise that every dream, no matter how audacious or humble in its origin, deserved a chance to flourish. They laughed at his dreams, but now his name resonates at Harvard. Subscribe to see more stories where dignity triumphs over prejudice.